I still remember that dinner like it happened last night. Every clink of glass, every fake laugh, every slow burn of shame crawling up my neck. My wife's sister Chloe had insisted we come. "You'll love him," she said. "Ethan's incredible, successful, charming, the real deal." I didn't argue. I just finished up late at the garage, scrubbed my hands until the grease stains faded to gray, and put on the one collared shirt that still looked decent. I wanted to make a good impression, or at least not embarrass my wife, Emily. The restaurant was one of those places that felt allergic to working people. Marble floors, white tablecloths, a menu with no prices. The kind where you know the bill is designed to remind you of your place. Chloe waved as we entered, her smile stretched tight. Beside her sat Ethan, tall, glossy, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. He shook my hand like he was testing my grip, his smile too wide. "Ah, the mechanic," he said, as if introducing a novelty act. I laughed politely, brushing it off. "Yeah, I own a little auto shop down by Maine. It keeps the lights on." Ethan leaned back, smirking. "I admire that. It takes real courage to stick with hands-on work." His eyes flicked to my knuckles, still rough despite my best efforts. "Guess you never get tired of the smell of oil, huh?" Chloe snorted into her wineglass. Emily chuckled, nervous, quiet, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I forced a smile, pretending not to notice how Ethan's words carried the weight of mockery. Throughout dinner, he wouldn't stop. Every topic turned into an opportunity for him to flaunt something. His latest investment property, his imported watch, his weekend trips to Dubai. Then, as the main course arrived, he looked right at me and said, "So tell me, man, what's it like being the guy who fixes rich people's cars but never drives one?" The table burst out laughing. Even the waiter smirked. I stared at my plate, heat building behind my eyes. Emily didn't defend me. She just reached for her wine, her face flushed. I could tell she was embarrassed, not for him, but for me. I swallowed hard. "It's fine," I said softly. "Not everyone needs to drive a fancy car to feel successful." My voice barely carried over the laughter. Ethan leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Oh, come on, don't be sensitive. We're just having fun." That's when something shifted inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, not yet. It was a cold, sharp awareness. I realized I didn't belong in their world, and maybe I didn't want to. But I also knew I'd never forget the way they looked at me, like I was less. When dessert came, I barely touched it. I just watched them. The way Chloe leaned into Ethan's expensive arrogance, the way Emily tried to match their smiles. I saw it then, how easily respect could vanish once money entered the room. On the drive home, the silence between Emily and me felt heavy enough to choke on. She finally muttered, "You were awfully quiet tonight." I kept my eyes on the road. "Didn't feel like competing," I said. She sighed, looking out the window. "Ethan was just joking." "Yeah," I said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Just a joke." But inside, something old and tired began to twist, a promise forming quietly in the back of my mind. I didn't know it yet, but that dinner, that one humiliating night, would be the last time I ever let anyone laugh at me like that again. Long before that dinner, before Ethan's smug grin and Chloe's brittle laughter, life was simple, quieter, smaller, but real. I wasn't born with much, and I never expected to be. My father was a truck driver who worked himself into an early grave, and my mother cleaned houses until her hands gave out. I learned early that dignity doesn't come from what you wear or where you eat. It comes from showing up when people need you. After high school, while others chased college degrees they couldn't afford, I took an apprenticeship at an old auto shop run by a man named George. He taught me everything, not just how to rebuild an engine, but how to rebuild a reputation when the world assumes you're replaceable. "Keep your word clean and your hands steady," he used to say. That's how men like us stay standing. When George retired, he sold me the place for half of what it was worth because, in his words, I gave a damn. It wasn't much. Cracked floors, flickering lights, a smell that never quite left my clothes, but it was mine. Every dented car I fixed, every loyal customer who came back, Every late night spent under a hood with music playing, softly in the background, all of it made me proud. Then came Emily. She brought light into that noisy little garage. The day she walked in needing her brakes replaced. I still remember how she looked at me. Not with judgment, but curiosity. She was soft-spoken, educated, dressed neatly, and came from a family that measured worth in degrees and designer shoes. I never expected her to say yes when I asked her out. But she did. And against all odds, she kept saying yes. We got married young, in a small ceremony at a park, surrounded by people who believed love meant more than luxury. I thought her family would warm up to me with time, but they never really did. Her parents were polite, but distant. The kind of politeness that makes you feel like a stray dog invited into the living room. Chloe, though, she never hid her disdain. From day one, she made it clear she didn't think I belonged. She'd show up to our gatherings in designer outfits, her laughter loud enough to fill every silence. "So," she'd ask with a smirk, "still fixing old cars? You should talk to my friend who manages investments. You'd make more money watching him work than doing what you do." Emily would laugh awkwardly, always trying to keep peace, but I saw the truth in her eyes. She didn't know how to defend me without stepping out of her sister's shadow. Over the years, I learned to swallow it. To smile when they spoke over me. To let Chloe dominate every dinner table conversation about ambition and making connections. I'd sit quietly, listening, knowing that the hands they mocked were the same ones paying our bills, fixing our home, building a future brick by brick. But being quiet doesn't mean being blind. I noticed how Emily's tone changed after every family visit. How she'd compare our lives to Chloe's new apartment or boyfriend. How she'd sigh at my old truck or complain about oil stains on my jeans. Still, I didn't resent her. Not really. I understood that she'd grown up surrounded by people who measured success in things that glittered. I just hoped one day she'd see that there's more worth in something built with effort than bought with ego. For a while, she did. When times were tough, she stood by me. When the pandemic hit and my business nearly went under, she helped with the books, worked extra shifts, and reminded me we were a team. Those moments felt pure, like we'd built something real, something theirs could never buy. But as Chloe's world grew shinier, Emily's grew restless. I could see it in the way she scrolled through social media, comparing our lives to people flashing their wealth. She stopped inviting friends over. She wanted nicer restaurants, better clothes, a little more comfort. I wanted that too, for her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that every small victory I earned was invisible to her family. And then Chloe started dating Ethan, the man who would later humiliate me at that dinner. The first time Emily told me about him, she called him a real success story. That phrase stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd spent my life proving myself through honesty, hard work, loyalty, the kind of success that doesn't get applause but keeps families fed. But in their world, that kind of success didn't count. Sometimes I wonder if people like Chloe ever see what their arrogance costs. How many small kindnesses they crush under the weight of their own pride. Back then, I thought the worst thing about their world was how cold it felt. I hadn't yet learned how cruel it could become. Before the laughter, before the humiliation, I believed I could live quietly on the edges of their circle, unbothered by their judgment. I thought if I kept my head down and worked hard, they'd see me for who I really was. But that dinner proved what I'd been too proud to admit, that no matter how much I gave, I would always be the punchline in someone else's story. And once a man realizes that, something inside him begins to change. The restaurant Chloe picked looked like the kind of place where people pretended to be richer than they were. Glass walls, dim lights, waiters in suits, and prices that screamed exclusivity. Emily and I were the last to arrive. Chloe waved us over with her usual sparkle, rehearsed, camera ready. Beside her sat Ethan, her new boyfriend, all charm and confidence. He stood to shake my hand, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Chloe's told me so much about you," he said, his grip firm, lingering a second too long. "You run." What was it again? A little car thing? "My garage," I replied evenly. "Yeah, it keeps me busy," he chuckled. "That's great, man. I admire people who can work with their hands. I could never. He glanced down at his gold watch as if it were proof of that. Emily squeezed my arm under the table, her silent plea for me to stay calm. I did. I told myself it was just small talk, harmless ego fluff. But every word from Ethan dripped with the kind of casual arrogance that only people born too comfortable could master. He started talking about his company, investments, startups, acquisitions, words that rolled off his tongue like trophies. Chloe laughed at every line, touching his arm, her voice syrupy with admiration. "He's so driven," she said. "You should hear the deals he's closed. It's insane." "I'm sure it is," I said, forcing a smile. Dinner hadn't even begun, but I could already feel the divide across the table. Emily's parents leaned in toward Ethan, hanging on his every word. My stories, when I told them, always seemed to die halfway across the table. The waiter poured wine, and conversation flowed like a stream I couldn't step into. Ethan told a story about a friend who refused to take risks and ended up changing tires for a living. Everyone laughed, even Chloe's mother. I sat there, chewing slowly, pretending the joke wasn't aimed squarely at me. Chloe turned to me with her glass raised. "You must have so many funny stories from your garage, right?" I smiled faintly. "Yeah, sure. Like the guy who tried to fix his car himself using YouTube tutorials. Nearly blew up his engine." Ethan grinned, swirling his wine. "See? That's what I love about guys like you. You're resourceful. You make do with what you've got. Respect." His tone was friendly, but his eyes were cold. Chloe giggled. "Ethan, stop," she said, though she didn't mean it. Emily shifted uncomfortably. I could feel her embarrassment, not for them, for me. She didn't look at me much that night. When the main course arrived, Ethan steered the conversation toward real business. He spoke about profit margins and stock portfolios while I nodded quietly, knowing my world didn't speak that language. At one point, I mentioned that I'd been saving to expand the shop, maybe hire another mechanic or two. Ethan tilted his head, smirking. "That's cute," he said. "Everyone starts somewhere." "Yeah," I replied, meeting his gaze. "Some of us just don't forget where we started." The table went silent for a moment. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe I'd earned a sliver of respect. Then Chloe laughed, loud and shrill. "Oh, don't be so serious," she said. "Ethan's just teasing." Ethan leaned back, grinning. "Hey, no harm done. I'm sure you'll make it one day." The laughter that followed felt louder than it was. It echoed in my chest, hollow and humiliating. Even Emily laughed. Softly, nervously, like someone afraid to be the only one who didn't. I sat there, staring at the tablecloth, watching the red wine ripple in my glass. My face felt hot, but my hands stayed still. Years of swallowing pride had taught me that silence could be armor, but that night, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like surrender. Ethan kept talking, his voice booming with confidence while I drifted somewhere far away, back to my garage, where the smell of oil and steel felt honest, where my worth wasn't measured in wristwatches or car models. Every time I looked at Emily, I saw the flicker of something I hadn't seen before. Not pity, not love, but distance. Like she was realizing how different our worlds truly were. I wanted to leave, to take her hand and walk out. But I stayed. Because walking away would have meant giving them exactly what they expected, that I didn't belong. So I smiled, lifted my glass, and raised it to Ethan. "To real success," I said quietly. He grinned. To real success, everyone toasted. I took a sip, feeling the burn down my throat, and smiled wider than I should have. They thought they were laughing at a man who'd lost. They had no idea they were creating one who'd never forget. The drive home felt longer than usual, though the restaurant was only 20 minutes away. The road was dark, washed in the pale yellow of streetlights that flickered across the windshield like a heartbeat trying to steady itself. Emily stared out the window. Her face reflected faintly in the glass, distant and unreadable. Neither of us said a word for the first 10 minutes. The hum of the tires against the road filled the silence, steady, almost soothing, until it wasn't. Finally, she sighed. "You were really quiet back there." I kept my eyes on the road. "Didn't have much to say," she hesitated. Ethan can be a little much sometimes, but you know how he is. He jokes about everything. I laughed softly, though it sounded bitter. Yeah, a real comedian. She turned to me, her tone sharpening just slightly. You're taking it too seriously. He wasn't trying to insult you. That's just his personality. Confident, a little teasing. Confident, I repeated, gripping the wheel tighter. Right. I didn't want to argue. I didn't even want to speak. The air between us felt thin, stretched too far to hold warmth. I could still hear their laughter, the sound looping in my head, sharp and echoing, like a wound that refused to close. Not just Ethan's, but Chloe's and Emily's. That nervous little laugh that told me she'd rather join in than sit in the quiet beside me. I'd spent years convincing myself that love could bridge the gap between two worlds, that character mattered more than class, that hard work could earn respect. But tonight proved something else. People don't just look down on you because you have less. They convince themselves you deserve less. Emily spoke again, softer now. You know Chloe, she always exaggerates. I just didn't want to make things awkward. Awkward? I said quietly. You think that was awkward? I've been humiliated before, Emily. That wasn't awkward. That was them laughing because I reminded them of what they think they are above. She didn't answer. Her silence said more than words could. I looked at her, at the woman I'd built my life around, and saw how uncomfortable she looked. Not for me, but for herself. As if my embarrassment had splashed onto her too. Maybe that was the moment I realized she wasn't just quiet at that dinner because she didn't know what to say. She was quiet because part of her agreed with them. The thought hurt more than anything Ethan could have said. Outside, the city thinned into quiet streets. Rows of dark houses where normal people slept. People who didn't dine under chandeliers or laugh at others to feel powerful. I envied them. The simple peace of being unseen. When I pulled into our driveway, Emily didn't move. She just stared ahead, her fingers tracing the edge of her phone. You're angry? She said finally. I'm not angry, I replied, shutting off the engine. I'm disappointed. There's a difference, she frowned. You always take things so personally. Maybe because tonight was personal. I got out before she could answer. The night air was cool, heavy with silence. I walked to the garage, flicked on the light, and just stood there for a while, surrounded by the familiar smell of grease and metal, the sound of my own breathing. My world was small, sure, but it was honest. Everything in it had been built by my hands. Not inherited, not bought, not borrowed. For the first time, though, even this place felt hollow. Like I'd been stripped of something invisible but vital, my dignity maybe, or the illusion that I was enough. Emily came in after a few minutes, leaning on the doorframe. You know I love you, right? She said quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. But love shouldn't make you feel invisible. It shouldn't make you sit through laughter meant to cut you down and call it a misunderstanding. That night, as she went to bed, I stayed in the garage. The light buzzed above me, flickering slightly. I stared at my hands, the same hands Ethan mocked, the ones that kept our life running, and wondered when they'd stopped looking like something to be proud of. For the first time in a long while, I felt small. Not because of who I was, but because of who she saw when she looked at me. 3 days passed before I saw Ethan again. I hadn't expected to. Honestly, I'd hoped never to. I'd spent those days trying to shake off the weight of that dinner, burying myself in work, pretending every clank of a wrench and hiss of oil was enough to drown out the sound of their laughter. But on Thursday morning, a silver sports car rolled into the lot, low, sleek, and loud enough to make heads turn on the street. I wiped my hands on a rag, stepped out from the garage bay, and there he was. Ethan. Perfect suit, perfect grin, the kind of man who thought the sun rose just to catch his reflection. Well, well, he said, tossing his keys in the air before catching them lazily. Didn't think I'd find you open this early. I forced a neutral smile. We open at 7. What can I do for you? He glanced around the garage like it was an artifact from a poorer century. The car's been making a weird noise. Probably nothing major, maybe a belt or something. Figured I'd give you some business. Support small enterprises, you know? Appreciate that, I said, even though his tone told me he didn't mean it. He tossed me the keys without looking, like a man throwing scraps to a dog. They hit my palm harder than they should have. It's an import, he added. Limited edition. You probably haven't seen one of these before. I looked at the car, a custom European model, rare enough that I'd only ever read about it. I've seen a few, I said simply. Right, he said, smirking. Try not to scratch it. For a moment, I considered telling him to take his arrogance elsewhere. But something, pride maybe, or quiet defiance, made me stay silent. I just nodded and watched as he checked his phone, impatient. He barely listened when I asked about the symptoms. It's fine, he said, waving me off. Just tighten whatever needs tightening. Bill me when you're done. Then he turned, already walking toward his waiting car service, a chauffeured SUV, because of course he wouldn't lower himself to wait in a garage. As he left, I caught a glimpse of Emily's sister in the passenger seat. Chloe. She didn't even look at me. When they drove off, the smell of expensive cologne lingered in the air, sharp and artificial. I stared at the car for a long moment before getting to work. Under the hood, I expected to find a simple belt issue, maybe a cracked hose. But what I saw made me pause. The engine block wasn't stock. It had been replaced, rebuilt, or swapped. And not by the manufacturer. The serial number had been crudely re-stamped, the kind of job you'd only notice if you'd worked with engines your whole life. I leaned closer, tracing the numbers with my finger. The pattern didn't match the car's make. It belonged to a batch from a different model, one linked to an import line I'd recently heard whispers about. A company that had been under quiet investigation for moving stolen or smuggled luxury vehicles through shell businesses. I straightened slowly, heart thudding. It could have been nothing, but I knew enough about that world, shady resales, falsified titles, to recognize the signs. The funny thing was, the company name etched faintly on the part's side looked familiar. I grabbed a flashlight and focused in. EML Imports. My breath caught. Emily's initials. But it wasn't her company, at least not that I knew of. Still, something about it clawed at the back of my mind. I checked the paperwork Ethan had left in the glove box. Registration, maintenance logs, purchase documents. Everything was pristine, maybe too pristine. Dates lined up too neatly. Dealers that didn't exist. It was all polished on the surface, but underneath, it smelled rotten. I stood there, engine humming faintly, thinking about the man who laughed at me just days earlier. The man who told me I'd make it one day. And now here he was, rich, untouchable, but driving something that wasn't what it appeared to be. There was a spark inside me then. Not anger, not even revenge yet, but curiosity. A sense that maybe the balance of power wasn't as one-sided as it had seemed at that dinner table. I decided to fix the car anyway. But as I worked, I kept glancing at that serial code, memorizing every digit, every detail. Something told me I'd want them later. By the time I was done, the noise was gone. The engine purred perfectly, hiding its secrets beneath polished metal. When I called Ethan to tell him the job was finished, he didn't answer. Just a quick text back. Send the invoice to my assistant. I'll pick it up next week. Typical. I looked at the car one last time before shutting off the lights. It gleamed under the fluorescent glow, beautiful, deceptive, like the man who owned it. That's when I realized the truth. The people who laugh at you the loudest often have the most to hide. And sometimes, fate hands you the key, literally, to their undoing. It had been nearly a month since Ethan dropped off his car. A month of silence. I'd almost forgotten about him, buried in the rhythm of repairs, invoices, and long evenings spent under the hum of fluorescent lights. But fate, I've learned, has a strange sense of timing. It was a Saturday night, just before closing, when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice that followed wasn't. "Hey, this is Ethan," he said, his tone tight. "My car, well, it just died on me. I'm at the Civic Grand Hotel, charity event. I need it fixed now." I glanced at the clock, 9:47 p. "Imam." "We're closed," I said flatly. He hesitated. "I'll pay extra. A lot extra. Just, please get here fast." Something in his voice caught me off guard. Gone was the smug composure, the casual superiority. What I heard instead was panic, the kind that comes when pride and image collide head-on with reality. So, I went. Not out of kindness, but curiosity. The Civic Grand was lit up like a chandelier, the kind of place where even the air seemed expensive. Outside, a crowd lingered near the valet circle, guests in gowns and suits milling about. And there it was, Ethan's silver car, hood up, hazard lights flashing like a silent alarm. Ethan stood beside it, pacing, his perfect suit slightly rumpled. When he saw me step out of my truck, his relief was instant but laced with discomfort. "You made it," he said, forcing a smile. It won't start. I have people waiting inside." "I can see that," I said, opening the hood. The heat hit my face. I scanned quickly. Same issue, same part. A minor fix, really, but one that needed steady hands and patience. Guests drifted closer, curious. A couple of photographers even raised their cameras, amused by the sight. The city's golden boy stranded, his savior in grease-stained overalls. I didn't rush. I took my time, tightening, adjusting, cleaning contacts. Ethan kept glancing around nervously, whispering, "Can you hurry? This looks bad." I looked up briefly, meeting his eyes. "You said it yourself once. Some of us just make do with what we've got." He froze, realizing I was echoing his own words back at him. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. When I finally closed the hood and turned the key, the engine purred to life. Smooth, strong, perfect. The small crowd around us broke into polite applause. Ethan laughed awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess you're good at what you do after all," he said loudly, performing for the onlookers. "Couldn't have done it without this guy." He clapped me on the shoulder, but the gesture rang hollow. I smiled slightly. "No worries. I'll send the invoice." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crisp bills, trying to hand them to me like a tip. I looked at his hand, then at the faces watching. Reporters, investors, guests. "That won't be necessary," I said. "Just glad to help." The cameras caught everything. As I walked back to my truck, I heard one woman murmur, "That mechanic handled himself better than half the men in there." Her friend laughed softly. "I'd trust him with my car over any of those suits." Ethan heard it too. His smile faltered. For the first time, I saw something crack in his expression. Not anger, not even humiliation, but something rawer. Awareness. The kind that seeps in when your mask starts slipping in front of the very people you built it for. When I drove off, the reflection of the gala shimmered in my rearview mirror. The glittering lights, the crowd, and Ethan standing there, still clutching his keys like they no longer meant power. That night, the road felt lighter beneath my tires. Not because I'd humiliated him, but because I hadn't needed to. He'd done that all on his own. It started like a whisper carried on the wind, faint, uncertain, but impossible to ignore once you heard it. I didn't plan it, not exactly. I just let things happen. Sometimes silence is louder than shouting, and truth has a way of traveling on its own when you give it a nudge in the right direction. About 3 weeks after the gala, I began noticing patterns. Certain clients of Ethan's company, the flashy import firm he bragged about, started coming by my garage. They weren't there for repairs. They were there to talk. They'd drop small comments while I worked. "You ever deal with his business before? Seems a little off." Or, "He promised parts from Germany, but they look like cheap knockoffs." I never confirmed anything. I just listened. And when they asked if I'd heard anything, I'd shrug, pretending I didn't know much. "Can't say for sure," I'd tell them. "But sometimes what's under the hood doesn't match what's on the label." That was enough. Soon after, I heard that one of Ethan's clients had pulled out of a major deal. Then another. Chloe stopped visiting the garage with her usual smug smile. My wife mentioned over dinner that Chloe was stressed. "Ethan's having some business problems, but he'll fix it," she said, trying to sound confident. I nodded, hiding my thoughts behind a calm expression. But I remembered what I'd found that night in Ethan's car. The serial code, the mismatched import data, the hidden trail of false registration numbers. It had all been sitting there, buried beneath the surface, just waiting for someone to notice. I hadn't told anyone, hadn't confronted him, hadn't bragged. I simply made sure the right eyes saw the right details. One quiet morning, an envelope found its way to a certain department. No return address, no fingerprints, no trace. Just a stack of documents, serial matches, and trade inconsistencies pointing directly toward Ethan's firm. After that, I washed my hands, both literally and metaphorically. I didn't expect things to move so fast. Within 2 weeks, local business news began hinting at an investigation into questionable import practices. Then came the online threads, the speculation, the social media whispers, that the golden boy might not be so golden after all. At the next family gathering, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Chloe arrived alone. She smiled too brightly, spoke too quickly. My wife asked gently, "Where's Ethan?" "Oh, he's busy," Chloe replied, waving her hand as though brushing away a fly. "Just dealing with some stupid rumors. People love tearing down successful men, don't they?" Everyone murmured politely, but the air was heavy. Even my father-in-law, who had adored Ethan, kept glancing at his phone, pretending to check emails. I stayed quiet, stirring my coffee, watching. Every time Chloe laughed, it sounded a little more hollow. That night, as we were leaving, my wife sighed in the car. "They're saying Ethan's company might get audited," she said softly. "It's crazy. One bad story and people act like it's the end of the world." I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on the road, the rhythmic hum of the tires, the reflection of streetlights flickering across the windshield. Inside, I felt something shift. Not joy exactly, not satisfaction, but peace. Ethan had once told me, "Success is about power." But he never understood that real power doesn't come from control. It comes from patience, from knowing when to speak, and when silence does the speaking for you. By the end of that month, Ethan's car was up for sale online, his prized possession, the one he'd once paraded like a trophy. The listing price was desperate, almost half its worth. I scrolled past it with quiet amusement. In my garage, business was steady. My hands were still stained with oil, my shirt still worn, but there was something new in how people looked at me. Respect, maybe, or recognition. I'd become invisible to them for years, the quiet mechanic in the background. Now, without raising my voice, without throwing a punch, I'd watched a man like Ethan start to crumble under the weight of his own greed, and all I had done was let the truth breathe. It was strange how life could loop back on itself. Same restaurant, same polished table, same faces pretending everything was perfect. Months had passed since that first dinner, and I'd told myself I wouldn't go through that humiliation again. But my wife insisted. "It's Chloe's engagement," she said. "We can't not show up." So there I was, in the same seat where I'd once been laughed at for the dirt beneath my fingernails. Only this time, my hands were clean, and my silence had teeth. Ethan sat at the head of the table, all charm and control, though something in his smile had changed. It was tighter, thinner, the edges fraying beneath his expensive suit. He poured wine like he owned the world, but his eyes flicked around the room too much, scanning, calculating. Chloe clung to his arm, beaming like she'd just won a trophy, not realizing she was gripping a grenade. Dinner began with the same ritualistic chatter. Job promotions, travel plans, the same polite laughter that always seemed to orbit around Chloe's world. Ethan dominated every sentence, throwing in stories about exclusive investors, big projects in Dubai, and tax strategies no one else could possibly understand. Everyone nodded along, pretending to care. I just listened. Calm, quiet, invisible again. At least to them, but I noticed everything. The faint tremor in Ethan's hand when he reached for his glass. The way Chloe kept asking if he was okay. The forced smile he gave when my wife congratulated them. Beneath the surface charm, something was cracking. I could almost smell it. That fear men like him get when the walls start closing in. Midway through the meal, as the main course arrived, steak, perfectly seared, bleeding slightly in the middle, the restaurant door opened. 2 men in dark suits stepped in, scanning the room before approaching the table with quiet precision. The murmurs around us softened to whispers. They didn't need to announce who they were. Their calm, deliberate walk said everything. "Mr. Ethan Cole?" one of them asked, polite but firm. The entire table froze. Ethan looked up, blinking. "Yes?" His voice carried the same confidence he used to belittle others, but I heard the faint catch beneath it. "We're with the Financial Crimes Division," the man continued, pulling out a small badge. "We'd like to ask you a few questions regarding Argon Exports Limited and their recent shipments." "It won't take long." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the music from the restaurant's sound system seemed to pause. Chloe frowned, confused. "What's this about?" she asked, laughing nervously. Ethan's face drained of color. "I'm sure there's been some mistake," he said quickly, trying to keep his voice level. "This isn't the place for—" But the second man interrupted, sliding a small folder onto the table. "We have reason to believe that a number of vehicles registered to your company were fitted with unregistered import components," he said. "Specifically, serial numbers traced to smuggling routes used for tax evasion. We have the records and photographic documentation." My pulse stayed steady. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just sipped my water while the air around us turned into ice. Ethan reached for the file, hands trembling now. "This is ridiculous," he said, flipping through the photos. "These could have come from anywhere." The official tilted his head slightly. "This particular one," he said, tapping a photo, "came from your personal vehicle. The modification was discovered during a repair at a local garage. You remember that, don't you?" Ethan froze. The sound of a fork clinking against a plate rang out like thunder. My wife glanced at me, her eyes wide, her mind racing. But I didn't look back. Everyone at the table was watching Ethan now, their previous admiration dissolving into discomfort. Chloe's face was pale. "Ethan, what are they talking about?" she whispered. He stammered something, words about business competitors, planted evidence, misunderstandings. But every sentence tangled itself, choking him further. The officials remained calm, unbothered, letting the silence press harder. One of them finally said, "We'll continue this conversation privately, sir. Please come with us." For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Then, as if realizing resistance would only worsen the spectacle, he stood. His chair scraped sharply against the floor. He adjusted his jacket, forced a smirk, and said, "This is a mistake. I'll clear it up." No one replied. As the 2 men escorted him away, I caught the briefest flicker of eye contact. It wasn't anger I saw there. It was realization. He finally understood. The whispers began almost immediately. Chloe covered her face, mumbling that there had to be some misunderstanding, that Ethan was innocent, that he'd fix it. But the damage was done. Her engagement dinner had turned into a public reckoning. The waiter hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to continue serving dessert. My wife sat in stunned silence, her hand resting on mine beneath the table. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back either. After a while, I stood up. "We should go," I said softly. No one stopped me. No one laughed this time. As we walked out of the restaurant, I glanced once over my shoulder. The same chandelier that had sparkled above my humiliation months ago now hung above a table full of shocked faces and shattered pride. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt balanced, like the scales had quietly shifted back into place. The night air outside was cool and calm. My wife finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know about this?" I looked straight ahead. "Some things," I said. "Not everything." She didn't press further. Maybe she knew. Maybe she didn't want to. But as we reached the car, my car, not some imported showpiece, I caught my reflection in the window. Same hands, same man, but something in my eyes had changed. I wasn't just the mechanic anymore. I was the one who'd fixed more than engines. The sound of polished shoes and low murmurs filled the restaurant like static. The entire family sat frozen, eyes darting between the officers and Ethan, who now looked nothing like the man who once mocked me with a smirk over dinner. His perfect hair was slightly out of place, his confident grin reduced to a twitching line. His voice, usually smooth and commanding, cracked like dry wood as he insisted there'd been a mix-up. But there was no mix-up. The truth was finally doing what it always does. Rising. Slow but unstoppable, like oil surfacing through water. "I'll call my lawyer," Ethan said, trying to regain control, but no one answered him. Even Chloe, his fiancée, had her hands over her mouth, her expression hovering between disbelief and humiliation. Around the table, forks lay abandoned, half-cut pieces of steak going cold on designer plates. The younger cousins, the ones who'd once laughed the loudest, just stared, eyes wide and frightened. They'd grown up believing money made a man untouchable. Now they were watching what happened when the floor gave out. One of the officers gestured toward the door. "Mr. Cole," he said calmly. "This way, please," Ethan's chair screeched as he stood. His napkin slipped from his lap and fell to the floor like a surrender flag. He hesitated for a moment, scanning the faces of the family that had adored him, trying to find one ally in the crowd. But all he found were lowered gazes. For once, no one wanted to be seen standing beside him. He tried to speak again, but the words stumbled out like broken parts. You don't know what's going on. This is temporary. I'll fix it, you'll see." The officers didn't wait. They guided him toward the exit, firm but controlled, as whispers began rippling through the restaurant. A few guests from nearby tables craned their necks, trying to see who the well-dressed man being escorted out could possibly be. The maitre d' shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene or pretend this was all normal. Chloe finally stood, her chair knocking against the table. "This is insane," she said, her voice trembling. "Ethan, tell them it's a mistake." Ethan didn't look back. The doors opened, letting in a wash of cool night air before closing behind him. The sound of it, the quiet finality, was almost musical. Silence settled. Heavy, suffocating, familiar. The same silence I'd once drowned in while everyone laughed at me. But now it belonged to them. No one moved. No one dared to meet my eyes. I sat back in my chair, reached for my glass, and took a slow sip of water. The taste was clean. Cold. I let it linger a moment before setting the glass down carefully. Deliberately, like a man savoring the calm after a storm. Across the table, Chloe was shaking, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. "He's innocent," she whispered to no one in particular. "He's innocent, he didn't mean—" Her voice faded. My wife stared at the tablecloth, her hand trembling around her fork. She didn't say anything. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe part of her understood that this moment wasn't just about Ethan. It was about every time I'd been told to lighten up, every laugh she hadn't stopped, every time she'd chosen comfort over loyalty. I didn't need to rub it in. I didn't need to say a word. The silence said enough. Finally, after what felt like forever, Chloe's father cleared his throat and muttered something about bad timing and how unfortunate this all is. The words sounded weak, like excuses trying to disguise shame. I smiled faintly. Guess dinner's over early this time, I said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't revenge in the loud cinematic way. It was simply truth, spoken with the calmness of someone who'd been through fire and come out unburned. No one laughed. Chloe looked like she wanted to throw her drink at me, but she didn't. Instead, she sat down hard, eyes blank, mouth set in a trembling line. My wife looked up then, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't look at me with quiet embarrassment. She looked at me with something else, something like realization. I stood slowly, adjusted my jacket, and nodded to the table. "Take care," I said quietly. Then I turned and walked out. The air outside felt lighter than I remembered. The hum of the city, the glow of headlights, the chatter from nearby tables. It all felt distant. Behind me, the restaurant was still buzzing with whispers, the kind that travel fast through family circles and social ladders. I knew what tomorrow would bring: gossip, speculation, sympathy for Chloe, pity for my wife. And maybe, though they'd never admit it, a little respect for me. I didn't need any of it. As I reached my car, I caught a reflection in the window again. Not just my own face, but the faint shimmer of peace behind it. I thought of Ethan's smirk that first night, the laughter that had burned through me, the way it had felt like everyone saw me as small. And then I thought of how easily everything he'd built on arrogance and fraud had collapsed. Funny how quickly people forget that the quiet ones are always watching. Before starting the engine, I sat there a while, letting the moment sink in. There was no joy, no gloating, just an even calm, like the steady hum of a well-tuned motor. Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums softly under the hood, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The days after the dinner were surreal. The news spread quietly at first: whispers, social media posts, polite inquiries from neighbors and distant relatives. Chloe didn't answer her phone for a week. When she finally surfaced, she was subdued, avoiding the parties and dinners she'd once dominated with her laughter and charm. Ethan's name was never mentioned aloud at family gatherings, as if erasing it could erase the shame. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened for me. Business at the garage picked up in ways I hadn't anticipated. Word had traveled, not because I bragged, not because I'd shown off. People respected skill, integrity, and quiet competence. New clients came with cars that needed careful attention, trusting the mechanic who could see beneath the surface. Even older customers, who had once teased me about working with my hands, now gave nods of approval, subtle acknowledgments that didn't need words. My wife and I spoke more in those weeks than we had in months. One evening, she looked at me across the kitchen table, eyes soft. "I should have said something that night," she admitted. "I shouldn't have just laughed along." "I'm sorry." I reached across and took her hand. "We were both stuck in that moment," I said. "But we're here now. That's what matters." We started spending evenings walking the neighborhood, talking about our dreams again, our little routines that had been buried under the weight of family expectations and unspoken resentment. It felt grounding, like we were rediscovering the marriage we'd built quietly, without the noise of comparisons or envy. Even at family gatherings, the atmosphere had shifted. Chloe's smirk no longer dominated the room, and her parents spoke to me differently, cautiously, as if recognizing the man who had stayed steady while everything else collapsed. There was no triumphalism on my part, no gloating. The quiet knowledge of what had happened, the subtle shift of power, was enough. At the garage, I noticed a change too. Apprentices and young workers asked questions, eager to learn, watching how I moved under the hood, how I examined each part with care. There was pride in teaching them, in passing on skills, in knowing that competence and patience mattered more than arrogance or money. And every now and then, when a luxury car rolled in for service, I couldn't help but smile a little. The memory of the silver sports car and the man who had once mocked me was no longer bitter. It was a reminder of how quietly, steadily, truth had a way of catching up. I felt lighter, humbler, and closer to my wife than ever before. There was a satisfaction in knowing we had weathered it all together. The humiliation, the waiting, the reckoning, and come out intact, stronger, and grounded. The world outside could keep spinning with status, appearances, and arrogance. Inside our little garage, and in the quiet moments at home, there was honesty, respect, and a kind of peace that no money or laughter at someone else's expense could ever buy. Months had passed since the chaos of Ethan's downfall, yet life had a steady rhythm now, one that didn't rely on luxury or approval. The garage had become more than just a place for repairs. It had become a hub for the neighborhood, a space where skill and trust mattered more than wealth or titles. Today I was hosting a charity drive, a small, quiet event where I fixed cars for families who couldn't afford it, offering my time and knowledge freely. I watched a young couple pull up in a battered sedan, their hands clutching keys nervously. They'd saved for months just to get it running safely again. As I guided them to the front of the garage, I thought back to the night Ethan mocked me for blue-collar hands, the laughter echoing around a polished dining table. Those hands had worked long hours, built something from scratch, and now, they were giving more than he ever could with his arrogance and wealth. "You're sure you know how to fix it?" the man asked, attempting a joke to mask his nerves. I smiled, crouching beside the engine. "I've been doing this for a long time. Don't worry, it's in good hands." While I worked, my voice reflected quietly in my mind, a narration to the moment. They laughed because they thought class was bought. But class is what's left when money disappears. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about understanding what real dignity looked like. Patience, skill, integrity, and the quiet satisfaction of helping others. The couple watched closely as I tightened bolts, checked the fluid, and gave the car a careful polish. Their smiles grew wider as the engine hummed to life. The young woman's eyes shone with gratitude. "I can't believe you did all this for us," she said softly. I handed them the keys. "Just promise me you'll take care of it," I said. "And remember, sometimes it's not the car that carries you forward, but the people who keep it running." They laughed, lightly, nervously, and drove off, waving. I leaned back against the counter, hands resting on the familiar grease stains, and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The world outside could still chase wealth, status, and appearances. People like Ethan would always try to define success with flashy cars and brash words. But class, true class, it was quiet. It lived in the patience to build, the humility to serve, and the courage to act with integrity when no one was watching. A few of my neighbors came by to thank me, offering coffee or snacks, their smiles genuine. I shook hands with old friends and apprentices, the same people who'd once underestimated me, now looking at me with respect rather than amusement. The lesson had spread quietly, without fanfare. Dignity wasn't a showpiece. It was a choice. I glanced at the garage doors, open to the late afternoon light, the sound of engines and laughter blending into a rhythm that felt right. This was my stage now, not a dining room where smug words cut deeper than knives. Here, skill and integrity wrote the story, and every bolt I tightened was a small act of quiet justice. As I closed the hood of the last car and wiped my hands, I realized that I'd finally arrived at a truth I had always known, but only fully understood now. Class wasn't in the cars we drove, the money we earned, or the applause of strangers. Class was in the legacy we left behind, the people we helped, the honesty we held, and the dignity we carried quietly through life. I stood in the sunlight, watching the couple drive off, their faces bright, and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The laughter that once cut me now seemed distant, meaningless, a shadow of the past. What remained was quiet, steady, and unshakable. And that, I knew, was worth more than all the flashy displays in the world.